My name is Roger Berkowitz. I'm the founder and academic director here at the Hannah Arendt Center at Bard College, and thrilled to be with you today. We are engaged in reading from Arendt's book, posthumously published, edited by Jerome Cohen, Responsibility and Judgment. A whole series of essays, the first part of which is called Responsibility, and deals with really the question of how we should act in morally tenuous and difficult times. And so we read the essay, which was a lecture, Personal Responsibility Under Dictatorship, and we're currently reading a 4-part lecture that she delivered both at the University of Chicago and then later at the New School for Social Research, Some Questions of Moral Philosophy. We're going to continue reading these essays under the subsection Responsibility. We'll read Collective Responsibility, and then one of the really great essays she ever wrote, Thinking in Moral Considerations, which in a sense is a distillation of many of these ideas in one shorter essay, and we'll get there in a couple of weeks. But this is a really fun book. I think it's one of her most thoughtful and searching books, but it really does deal with questions of morality, which, as Arendt said, she didn't deal with through most of her life. She largely, as you all know, because you have been reading Arendt on your own and with me for a certain amount of time, she largely dealt with worldly issues, political issues. So totalitarianism, the human condition, what does it mean to act in the world, to be seen by others, on revolution. So again, a political book. It's really only in this period post Eichmann in Jerusalem, right? When she writes this book, Eichmann in Jerusalem, and she is confronted with this example, this phenomena of Adolf Eichmann, and asks herself, why? Why could he do this? And why do we have so much trouble judging him? Why was there so much disagreement and despair about how to judge someone like Eichmann? And why were people so upset by her judgment of him, which is that he should be killed, but that he should be killed not per se because he simply broke a law or did a crime, but that he was someone who, in supporting a regime, was responsible for it. And his responsibility was of such a scandalous nature that even if he himself was not profoundly evil in his intentions, his actions in the world meant that he could not be, his continued presence in the world could not be reconciled. And so these are the kind of questions that she starts to confront, and she confronts them in these essays. She confronts them again in her book, The Life of the Mind, where she, raises the question: are there is there any way to prevent this kind of really scandalous, horrific, plurality destroying evil in the world? And the answer she comes to develop at this time is that something about thinking may be the answer, may be the only potential idea or activity, and it is an activity that could prevent such evil. And so in this lecture course that we've been reading, Some Questions of Moral Philosophy, she's been pursuing that. And in the last session, she asks she asks this question, which is, okay, thinking is like a 2-in-1, right? When I think, I talk to myself. I say, oh my God, I can't believe I did that. Can I live with myself? And a thinking person has to remember what they've done. They can't simply put it out of their mind. They have to constantly talk to themselves and think with themselves. And so memory becomes core. And a thinking person is one who remembers what they've done. And a thinking person has to ask themselves, okay, can I live with myself if I do this? And sometimes the answer is yes. And she says, much of what we think of as immoral, most of us can live with, right? I mean, I think one of the challenges, not challenges, I think one of the interesting, insights of reading Arendt or Nietzsche, and I think she's very influenced by Nietzsche here on morality, is that, she has very little patience with what she calls the moralists. She says the moralists, are usually the first, they all say, oh, this is immoral, that's immoral, but they're the first to do and coordinate themselves with great immorality and great evil when the situation demands it. So she's not really talking about morality in that sense. She's talking, and she says, if you're thinking in this way, in this Socratic way, the real question, right, that allows you to avoid immorality, is that you have to not be able to live with yourself, that you have to what do I want to say? As I said last session, a moral person can be bad or good, right? You can be a bad person and yet a moral person. You can have vices. You can be smart or stupid, friendly or unkind. But if the moral person is a thinking being, she says, who's rooted in his thoughts or her thoughts and remembrances, and hence knows that he or she has to live with themselves, there will be limits to what he can permit himself to do. And these limits will not be imposed on him from the outside, but will be self-set. The point is, and this is on page 101, and we talked about it last session, but I just want to emphasize it because I think it is so important, that morality for her is not breaking social taboos or social rules. Immorality is doing something that you can't live with. And thus there's a kind of subjective or personal element to it. And yet it's not purely personal or subjective, because as we're going to talk about today, and as she's already sort of hinted at, there's a kind of intersubjective aspect to it. When I say I can't live with it, that means that as a thinking person talking to myself, I can't live with myself having done that. But that means that I have to already have imagined myself in conversation with a public world, with other thinking people, through this kind of enlarged mentality. And so when I say that I can't live with myself if I do this, it's not purely personal and subjective. It's personal and subjective, but in a thinking, judging way in which I put myself into conversation with the public and with other judging and thinking people. And that kind of sort of enlarged thinking and judgment is one aspect of her thinking about morality. It's what she'll call the Socratic element, and the way Socrates thinks about morality. But the problem, and I think she does think to some degree that this is a problem, the problem with this Socratic idea of morality as simply a byproduct of thinking, this problem with the idea that morality only applies to borderline cases in which I am potentially going to do something I can't live with, and that I have to stay true to myself, is that there's no connection between morality and doing good, right? You can do bad things and still be moral in the Socratic sense. Bad in the sense of things against social convention, against religion, against the rules. You could say, look, this law, not only do I not like it, but people break this law all the time. And I think thinking, thoughtful people, can say, look, maybe you shouldn't break this law for certain reasons, but people who break it are not evil. And I can reconcile. I can still live with myself for breaking this rule, this taboo, this law. And so she says there's another, so that thinking in this way can only set a negative, stop on things we can't do, that are things we can't live with, and that we can't live with in the sense of publicness, horrific things, right? But are there ways to think about a positive aspect of morality? And she says, we're not going to get there through thinking. Thinking will never tell us what we should do. It can only stop us from doing these things we can't live with. And the other aspect of morality, the positive aspect, comes from, whereas traditionally comes from, the will. And so she says, we need to look towards the will and thinking about the will to see if there's another aspect of morality, a positive aspect that tells us not only what we shouldn't do in this extreme borderline situation, but what we should do. And, the will is thought of in philosophy as the seat of action. The will has the power to tell us what I should do, the good. The will says, okay, I know I should eat my broccoli, but I don't want to. I want to eat ice cream. And, the will tells us, well, do what you're supposed to do, follow the rules, and eat your broccoli. And so the will has a kind of element of enforcement of the good. In this sense, the will is selfless. It doesn't think what I want to do. It's what I know I should do in a more, in a sense, according to societal rules. So whereas Socrates thinks that morality is actually a product of my concern with myself, namely what I can live with and what I can't. Christian morality, which is the morality of the will, and Arendt argues, and I think rightly, but it's a complicated argument, developed more in the book Life of the Mind, argues that the will really only emerges as a faculty of the mind with Christianity, with St. Paul and then Augustine. And for them, for Christianity, evil is not something that's concerned with the self. In fact, it's selfless. Even for Jesus, she said, he's much more large-minded towards wrongdoers than most of us moralists would be. He doesn't say that you that you can't, that people who do wrong can't get to heaven, because you have to forgive them, you have to reconcile with them, and there's a certain open-mindedness in Jesus's writings and thinking, according to Arendt. Similarly, for Hegel, the idea that we have to reconcile, Versöhnung, right, the spirit and the world, means that we reconcile the fact that there's evil in the world, and the evil is part of the goodness and the God's creation of the world. Nietzsche says that there's plenty of times when wickedness leads to goodness and truth. And so she says all philosophy, to some degree, reconciles with a certain amount of evil and accepts it. And so the will, which is this attempt to arbitrate or decide between what I want to do and what I ought to do, is is where she says we have to look at the problem of can we positively do something moral? Can we actually not just stop ourselves from being immoral, but actually do something moral? And the key sort of paradox of the will, which she talks about here and in the second part of the Life of the Mind on willing, is this fundamental brokenness of the will, right? On the one hand, I will to do good, right? I will to be always generous in my interactions with people I don't like, or I am, or my neighbors, and yet I can't. Sometimes I just want to scream, and I do. So that's I will and cannot. And sometimes I know I will that I should be generous to people I find abhorrent. And I simply will not say I don't want to do it. I'm fed up, and so I'm going to punch them in the face. So there's a brokenness to the will where sometimes I will to do good, but I cannot, and sometimes I will to do good, but I will not. And so this brokenness of the will, leads to this idea that the will is the seat of freedom. It's where I decide. Will I do what is thought to be good, or will I follow my own desires? And here's the problem: is that the will, on the one hand, makes us feel powerful, and that I will and I do what I will, but it also makes us feel powerless, and that we can't do what we will because we think we should will what we ought to do, and we have to command ourselves to obey our goodwill or our rational will. And so this idea of the will for her is always broken as an instigating power. But that's the first part of the will, as an instigator, right? That I will and I cannot, I will and I will not. But there's another part of the will, which she thinks really most people focus not on. Most people focus on the second part, not the first part, which is this idea of the will as the arbiter, as the judging function, as the liberum arbitrium, free arbitration. And in this case, the question is, I have two wills. I have a will to eat my broccoli and my will to drink the chocolate milkshake, my will to be nice to my neighbors, and my will to punch them in the face. And the will is the judging function, right? That I have these two conflicting voices in me, and I'm supposed to somehow find some impartial observer or arbiter that helps me judge morally or correctly. The problem here is that there's no rules for how I should judge in this case, right? In Kant's moral thinking, right, there are rules. There's the categorical imperative, but the problem with the categorical imperative, which simply says that I must act such that my maxim accords with universal law, it never tells me what universal law is, right? It doesn't tell me what I should do. But if we're going to leave morality and come to the question of how to act, so positive morality, we can't know the answers. What we have to do is look at each situation and somehow judge from it, how ought I to act? And thus, she says, and we should know this from her writings on Kant and Judgment, for those of you who read her essays on Kant's political judgment with us last year, that moral judgment is like the problem of taste. You can't define beauty. You can't say what the rules are according to how I should act towards my neighbor. There's a similarity between rules of taste and rules of morality. And thus, the question is now, if our will is how it tells us how we should act positively, and the will is a kind of judgment, we now enter into a third faculty of the mind, right? There's thinking, there's willing, and now a third one, which is judging. And the last few pages of some questions on moral philosophy are a very brief, account of her thinking about judgment. And the core of it is, just as quickly as I can, because I don't want to get caught in it, is that judgment for Arendt is, on the one hand, personal and subjective, but on the other hand, intersubjective and impersonal. It requires, she says, common sense, ein Gemeinsinn, not common sense as in, what everybody does, but a common sense is as what fits us into a community. This is on page 139. Fits us into a community with others. And so when I say I should treat my neighbor well and not punch her in the face, I do so not because there's a rule about punching my neighbor in the face, but because the community that I'm in, the public world that I'm in, if I ask myself, well, what not only what would other people do, but what would other people think they should do in this instance, not as a general rule, but in this instance, I would come to the conclusion that most people would say, bite my lip and say, hi, how are you? And move on. And this idea of fitting oneself into a community with others is predicated on the idea of imagination, or the faculty of imagination, right? And the faculty of imagination is the ability to imagine myself in conversation with others. It's what she has, what she and Kant both call an enlarged mentality. The point of the matter, she says on 140, is that my judgment of a particular instance does not merely depend upon my perception, my own perception, but upon my representing to myself something which I don't perceive, namely what other people would think. I have to imagine myself in a community of others, right? And she gives an example, right? Let me illustrate this. So this is on page 140 near the bottom. Suppose I look at a specific slum dwelling and I perceive in this particular building the general notion, which it does not exhibit directly, the notion of poverty and misery. I arrive at this notion by representing to myself how I would feel if I had to live there. That is, I try to think in the place of the slum dweller. So I look at it and I try and think not as me, Hannah Arendt or Roger Berkowitz, but as also others, but also as people living there. And I think, well, I would think I'm happy because I'm with my family and friends and I go to this, or would I think I'm poor and it's a slum? How would I think? And it's a tough judgment, right? How do you put yourself in the position of others? Through this imagination. She says, not through empathy, right? It's not about conforming in my judgments to theirs. I don't simply say, what do they think? And then say, I agree with them. It's, okay, take their views into account to the extent I can. And then still, she says on 141 at the top, still speak with my own voice, right? Make my judgment, but taking their understandings into account. So she says, I still speak with my own voice. I do not count noses, right? I don't just go around and say, what do you think? What do you think? What do you think? And majority rule wins in order to arrive at what I think is right. But my judgment is no longer subjective, right? It's not just based on my own account. The validity of this common sense grows out of the intercourse with people halfway through down the page, right? The validity of such judgments would be neither objective and universal. It's not a rule, but nor is it subjective. It's intersubjective and representative. The point here is that morality on its own may be based in reasons or rules of morality, right? But morality in the world of action, of what I should do, practical morality, is fundamentally based in plurality, in the idea that we all are here and we're different and we have different opinions and different perspectives. And it requires judgment in the sense of a common sense through imagination, And that means we have to constantly ask ourselves, what would other people think? Not by counting noses, but by trying to then come to what other people would think in a common sense. And that, she says, happens largely by thinking through examples. And she cites Kant again, who says in the Critique of Pure Reason that examples are the go-kart of judgment. So if we want to understand how we should act morally in a positive sense, we have to constantly ask ourselves about examples, right? What does it mean to be courageous? Well, we turn to examples, be it Socrates or Martin Luther King, right? What does it mean to be wise? Whether it's Solon or, maybe Hannah Arendt, who's your example. What does it mean to be moral? And she says, traditionally, one of our core examples of what does it mean to be moral was Socrates. Why? Because not what Socrates said, but what he did. He sacrificed himself for the common good. He said, it's better to suffer wrong than to do wrong. And he allowed himself to be killed as an illustration of that principle. And that it's people throughout the last 2,500 years have taken that example and thought it was meaningful, and thus held it up as part of our common sense of morality. But she says today, it's no longer something that we can assume is a common sense. People don't find the Socratic example of morality as meaningful as we have throughout, most of Western history. And so she says the real danger today is that we don't have examples of morality that we find moving and meaningful in that way. And so the greater danger today is what she calls indifference, that when we are confronted with examples, whether it be Socrates or whether it be someone who acts morally in the modern sphere, and we can think about people who we think do so, we sort of say yes but no. Like when I actually teach the Socrates examples, my students are like, yeah, it was sort of good that he sacrificed himself, but here they take a very different view. They say, well, he was sort of a victim, and they bring in the victim idea, and shouldn't he fight back? Shouldn't he have argued? And there's this idea that Socrates was wrong to allow himself to be sacrificed. I think, in fact, I would say that the majority of my students, at least in their initial reading of the Credo and the Apology, argue that Socrates was wrong. Now, I don't disagree with them, but I complicate it and get them trying to see the difficulty here. But the point is that I don't think it's a common sense view anymore that Socrates was right. And if you think you've been injured and you bring a case, and the case is going to tear a community apart, should you sacrifice your own self for the greater good of the community? That's the Socratic moral argument. And my students, again, their inclination is to say, no, you should fight for justice for yourself, and that justice is more important than the good of the community or the common sense, right? And that's a strong feeling that I think many people have today. And it's one of the things that Arendt is sort of thinking about. But her view is not that people will fight for justice or the common sense, is that they'll generally end up being indifferent, and they will refuse to judge at all. And she says on the last page, but the likelihood that someone would come and tell us that he does not mind and that any company will be good enough for him is, I fear, by far greater. Morally and even politically speaking, this indifference, though common enough, is the greatest danger. And connected to this, only a bit less dangerous, is another very common modern phenomena, the widespread tendency to refuse to judge at all. Out of the unwillingness or inability to choose one's examples, and one's company, and out of the unwillingness or inability to relate to others through judgment, arise the real scandala, the real stumbling blocks which human powers can't remove because they were not caused by human and humanly understandable motives. Therein lies the horror and at the same time, the banality of evil, right? It's when people, in a sense, coordinate themselves with large social bureaucratic systems of, imprisonment, slavery, genocide, and we say, oh, well, they're bad, these are bad things, but these are good, these are people I can deal with, and I can be indifferent to them, and I can live with them. And we refuse to judge. That's when we don't remove great evil, and when evil becomes a real problem. And so for Arendt, the problem of evil really becomes not only am I able to live with myself in the Socratic idea, but am I able to live with others? Who are my friends? And we have a tendency to say, I can pretty much live with anybody. And yet maybe we need to, and Arendt says that that's the kind of indifference that is dangerous. All right. Now I will say that there's a way in which, one can say, well, Arendt, aren't you sort of wrong here? I mean, aren't we living in a time in which so many people say, I can't live with people who are on the other political side, or I can't live with people who do this. And we have a tendency to only want to live with people we agree with. And I think that's an important counter. That said, there are many people who we agree with, who we make enormous excuses for on other things, right? So the lack of judgment is still present to a large degree, even though we seem to be judging people on certain political bases, certainly on certain moral bases. We show this indifference. Anyway, let me stop. These are very complicated and really rich, and I hope I'd love it if you guys put some tough examples and questions on the table as we talk about it. You can engage in these questions in the chat. Please be respectful of others. You can also go down to the reactions button and hit raise hand and engage the conversation publicly with us. This is a really rich and difficult themes, so please be respectful of others, but also don't be respectful of Arendt necessarily, right? Challenge her, raise some questions, and let's see where we can get to with this. So let's go. Neil, you're first.
Hi, thank you. When you were talking about the common sense and virtues, I know that most virtues, if you publicly say you're going to practice them, like being truthful or heaven knows chastity, you're going to get laughed at. But courage seems to have survived all of the. I mean, I'm not sure with exactly the students you were talking about, but I know that as somebody who's been volunteering with trying to help Ukraine, that the kind of courage that Zelensky showed, don't give me a ride, give me ammo, and those Marines who raised their middle fingers to a Russian warship at the second day of the war. So courage still is pretty much admired, I would think. So anyway.
Yeah, thanks, Neil. It's a good question, and I'm glad you asked it, right? Because as some of you know, one of the core programs of the Hannah Arendt Center is our Courage to Be courses and lecture series. And so this is something we think a lot about. And one of the interesting insights of many of our courses on courage and our discussions about courage is that so many people today are deeply critical of courage, right? The old argument, the way it's classically formulated by anyone from Aristotle, to the Stoics, is there's a fine line between courage and stupidity, right? Uh, is it courageous to run into a wall of machine gun fire and lead your troops into battle where you're going to be killed and mowed down? Or is it stupid? Is it courageous to you know uh, uh lead a raid against slavery with a bunch of people who are going to be destroyed and killed and tortured? Or is it foolhardy? The way my students would frame it today and is, well, yeah, I mean, it's, of course, there's a sign of kind of courage of Zelensky. Let's fight and let's not take refuge, but whatever. But the result of that is hundreds of thousands of deaths, economic and lifestyle destruction, an increasing threat of nuclear war around the world. And so, it's interesting. I mean, many of my Ukrainian friends and students are basically like, look, Zelensky is selfish and putting his own interest in being a hero ahead of the well-being of Ukrainian people who are now refugees and have had their lives disrupted. And so, I think that there's a lot of people who agree with you, Neil, that, this is an example of courage. And that's, I'll be honest, that's how I've largely seen it. But I've been chastised by many people on this matter, and I've been forced to confront the biases of my own view of this by many people who simply say, look, who cares about geopolitics? Who cares about, whether Russia and China are going to, build this alliance and whatever. And that this is basically the United States using Ukrainian citizens, not risking American lives, to fight a proxy war, for geopolitical reasons, and the Ukrainians being used and the Ukrainian government doing this for reasons that, make them heroes and this and that, but are really not serving the interests of humanity or the Ukrainian people. I'm not trying to decide the matter here. I simply am saying that I think we live at a time in which there are no highest values. That's a translation of nihilism, right? Nihilism, there are no highest values, which means that every value that you can articulate, where courage as the highest value, someone else can say, no, better to preserve life. Think about COVID. What was the highest value? Was the highest value to carry on and live in communities with love and support your loved ones and visit them, even if they were sick, and be courageous? Or was the highest value to quarantine, wear masks, not go see your sick and dying people, not have funerals, and preserve life? And so, the very definition of nihilism is that everything that we once thought was a highest value is now relative. Some people will say courage is the highest value, and other people will say life is the highest value. And we live at a time in which there's no agreement on higher values. And Neil says, wow, he lives in a bubble. And yeah, most of us do. But the point is that there are many people for whom, whatever value it is, one would say, no, that's not the highest value. Does that make, I know you're like, wow, but does that make sense to you, Neil, or not? I mean, I don't want to force the issue, but you understand why some people would be critical of this attitude of courage, right, as the highest value.
Yeah, I get it. I just, clearly, I'm not around people very much that say the other side, or they're kind enough not to say it to me. So
yeah, no,
I was
I think that's a really good point. I mean, we all talk about how we live in bubbles, but we usually mean that other people live in bubbles, right?
I do.
But we all do live in bubbles, and we largely gravitate towards people who see the world as we do. And judgment requires, reaching out and trying to understand the slum dweller or the, Ukrainian people who are really angry at Putin, but also angry at Zelensky. I mean, that's what I hear from a lot of Ukrainians I talk to. I mean, I think they're, there are some that are angry at Zelensky, but I think most are angry at Putin. But they just don't see. What they basically tell me is pox on all their houses. We just want to live our lives, right? All right, George. George, are you there? George? All right.
He has to unmute.
I don't know.
Unmuted now. Are you?
Okay.
Am I?
Yep.
Yeah, just briefly, apropos to your initial talk, are you familiar with Marie-Louise Knott?
Of course, she's actually going to be the National Endowment for the Humanities Hannah Arendt Fellow next semester at Bard at the Arendt Center, and she'll be giving one of the talks at our conference on friendship in October.
Okay, because I just found her, and she has a very original view in Hannah Arendt as far as what you were just speaking about. I think she, what she says, just quoting her, there was nothing trivial about the kind of laughter that Arendt advocated, but a deeply painful sense of the absurd, in which the central issue might have been not so much the banality of evil, but the evil of banality. That is, she thought she was talking about Arendt's sense of humor and sense of absurdism, which sort of really struck me, that it had to do with what she was saying, as for instance, that as far as Arendt's talking about common sense and Arendt's liking Kant because she was, as opposed to Hegel and other German philosophers, he also was a believer in common sense, etc., etc. But it's a very interesting discussion because, again, I read another, just looking at that, and I started reading her book, and I read something else that mentioned her, and had to be by, I forget his name, he's in Cambridge, and when he was writing about the difference between Arendt and a Russian absurdist, Kant. And the difference was, he said, the one thing is that Arendt sort of looked at this whole thing from a patrician viewpoint, whereas Karms, who was died in a Stalinist prison, was doing it from the absurdist common sense standpoint. And maybe you just want to discuss that a little bit.
Yeah. Thank you, George. I mean, the evil of banality, right? Which, is something that, I mean, Marie talks about, but also I think many others, it's not it's a phrase that you hear a lot. And I think Arendt herself at some points formulates it that way. Is this idea that indifference or shallowness is the core of evil, not the core of immorality, right? You can be deep and still do things that are thought to be bad, but you can't be deep and do truly evil things, and thus banality, shallowness, is actually the core of evil, or is what makes evil possible, and that's I think that is the core. If you want to understand the banality of evil, that's what you have to understand. Mitch. You got to unmute, Mitch.
Can you hear me?
Sorry.
Yeah. I had a question, just a kind of, I hope it's not too big a question, but it's on the question of am I allowed to introduce other Arendt texts and do the discussion, or we stick just to this text? I don't know what the.
You can, I mean, I don't go on a 20-minute
I
diatribe.
will not, I promise. My question, I mean, the thing that was a little confusing for me is the question of love, right? And Arendt writes a lot about the lack of a place for love in certain kinds of public forums. And I'm just wondering how she or how one would reconcile her. I mean, clearly I take her to be clearly a deeply moral thinker and a very serious thinker. And she talks about thinking, but I'm wondering what people think of her the question of love, or lack, or love not belonging in politics, right? That kind of what does that turn in Arendt relate to this essay, or are they not? I mean, in terms of, you might know his
No, I think I think there is a strong relation, so it's a good point. I mean, the argument about morality here, right, is that for the most part, morality is not a political idea, right?
okay.
Morality is associated with the self and thus with thinking. And morality only becomes political as a negation, as a negative,
I see.
as that which stops us from doing things because we can't live with ourselves with it. She says, then there's a second phenomenon, a faculty of that we think of concerned with thinking, with the mind and morale and possibly morality, and that's the will. The will is a much more political faculty, because the will tells us how to do good. But she says we have to break the will into two parts. There's the instigating will, right, of what I should do. And, she says the Christians like to think I should do good, but Nietzsche tells us it's a lot more complicated than that, because I often want to do good to feel powerful or to feel virtuous. And there's an element of the instigation of will that's not really about the good, but about a feeling of power and empowerment. And so, that part of the will is more political if you take it as I'm trying to do good. But Nietzsche tells us to underemphasize that part. But she says maybe Nietzsche underestimates the importance of rules and morality in thinking about the will. And so there is something about trying to do good. Someone tries to follow the law.
Okay.
But she says there's another element of the will, which is really not about doing good, but about judgment, arbitrating between conflicting wills. And that's brings us to a third faculty, not thinking, not willing, but judging. And this third faculty, again, while it has political implications, is really founded not in politics, but in aesthetics, in questions of taste, in questions of how to judge without rules. And that it is actually, but judging is a political activity insofar as it is an attempt to imagine a community of co-judgers, of others who judge with me, and build an intersubjective sense, so that when I say that the painting or the tulip is beautiful, or the painting is beautiful, or the bust of Zeus is beautiful, I'm making a claim, not just what I think, but what I think you should think. And when I say, you should tell the truth about, whether you cheated on the test, or you should tell the truth about, whether the election was stolen, or you should tell the truth about, whatever, you've done. I'm making a claim not just about my own feelings, not about rules, but about what we as a community believe. And that requires a kind of imagination, but it also requires an openness to, as Neil and I were discussing, get outside of our bubbles and think and talk to other people and hear other viewpoints, and not just accept their viewpoints. I mean, we could hear people who say Zelensky is an egomaniac who's trying to make himself the man of the year for time, but is actually killing and hurting average everyday people. We don't have to agree with that, right? But it may make us rethink a little bit our positions, or we have to figure out how to make our judgment taking that view into account. And that's where willing, in the sense of making a judgment of between different wills, becomes political. But she says that is really and that is where morality can be found also, right? Not only in thinking as a negation, but in the activity of judging, where I imagine a community and build a community, right? So, you've heard me, I don't know, for those of you, this line of Arendt's that talking about piety and justice can make the world more pious and just. Why? Because it's in that activity of talking, and in talking, imagining a community, and in imagining community, considering examples, and in considering examples, making judgments that attempt to build a common world, a shared reality, that we build a political world. We build a world that we, despite our plurality and differences, somehow can share. And so in that sense, judging, willing as judgment, but judging, as she frames it, is not just a negation, not just stopping us from doing evil, but an active building of a common world. And that's why judging is so political for her. Even though it's not about setting rules, it's about talking, thinking, bringing examples to bear, imagining, and coming to, through constant interactions and talking and thinking together and imaginations together, finding what we share amidst our differences. And that's a political activity. In fact, it may be the highest political activity, right? One of the constant questions for Arendt, well, if it's not political to say, you need housing, or you need welfare, or you need this, well, then what's politics? It's just acting what? Well, I think the answer is no. What's political is the act of talking and acting and thinking together in a way that builds a common sense. That's the activity of politics. And in a world right now where we are all in really bubbles, and people are so quick to ignore or judge or condemn people different from them politically, more so than anything else. What you're seeing is a depoliticization of the world in an Arendtian sense. We are simply unwilling to imagine ourselves in conversation with people who we find repulsive or wrong. And that is a deep depoliticization of our world in an Arendtian sense. And so that's where politics comes back in, through willing as judgment, right? The point is that the will is split into two parts: the instigation part of the will and the arbitrating part of the will. And the arbitrating part of the will is, for Arendt, the core of political judgment. Oh, and to bring it back to your question about love, right? Love, is a deeply is a deep feeling of my merging with another person. That in love, Arendt thinks, I almost lose myself and become bonded with someone else, and I lose my own independence of thought and judgment. And so for her, again, that's a deeply unpolitical or non-political or even anti-political activity. That doesn't mean, love is bad. I mean, she certainly, that's not, on the contrary, she thinks love is great, but she doesn't think it's political. Friendship, right? Where I can have a meaningful conversation with others who I am not bonded with, who are different from me, who I respect but don't agree with. That's politics for Arendt. Love in Arendt is she is a really profound loss of oneself, whereas morality and Socratic idea is based on oneself, and morality in Judgment is based on putting oneself into conversation with others, but still keeping oneself. And so love doesn't fit easily into either of these ideas. Does that answer your question or not? Maybe. I don't know if Mitch is still here. Okay. Dina.
Hi there. My question is about an entirely different subject in this text. On page 139, Arendt compares the questions about beauty and taste in the 18th century with the moral issues in the 20th century. And I was wondering if you could elucidate what assumptions, what sort of theoretical models about memory and time and history are underlying such a comparison. And the reason I ask is because it feels as if the viability of this type of comparison, and she says, for example, on 139, theoretically, we find ourselves today in the same situation in which the 18th century found itself with respect to mere judgments of taste. And a little later in that paragraph, we find ourselves today in exactly the same position when it comes to discussions of moral issues. So my question is, to what extent is the viability of this type of comparison between centuries sort of the premise for exemplary thinking that she's talking about? And if that is the case, if memory, history, time have a role to play here, then is imagination not just the bringing forth of that which is absent, but in some ways not a creative act itself, but rather a sort of thinking that repeats itself. I'm not saying necessarily that this is Hegelian or Marxian in any way, but I'm wondering what her theory about history is that underlines that exemplary thinking and this type of comparison.
Thanks, Dina. So yeah, this passage that Dina draws our attention to, right, is in the context of Arendt saying on 138, I mentioned the total collapse of moral and religious standards among people who, to all appearances, had firmly believed in them. And I mentioned the undeniable fact that few who managed not to be sucked into the whirlwind were by no means the moralists earlier on in this essay, right? In part one. So she's returning us back to the very beginning of the essay, where she's saying, look, this is all brought into my mind, and this is all a response to the moral collapse of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, when it seemed that people simply couldn't agree on whether fascism was good or bad. And there were people who defended it and people who thought it was awful. And, it's easy today to say, oh my God, fascism and totalitarianism were awful. But, there were a lot of people who thought, well, the world is falling apart. We need fascism. I mean, just like today, when Erdogan just won a democratic election in Turkey. Donald Trump won in 2016, a Democratic election, lost, but let's be honest, got a lot of votes. And there are others. There are many people who look at fascism and think we need order. El Salvador, I think, is a great example of this. I wrote about this in the Amor Mundi 2 or 3 weeks ago, but the president of El Salvador is insanely popular. And one of the reasons he's insanely popular is he has taken incredibly repressive measures to address violence of gangs and other elements that had made people uneasy, but in doing so, has completely erased civil liberties and rights. But he's incredibly popular for having brought order back. And so there's a kind of collapse of moral clarity. She's saying that is something that's a real fact of the late 19th, early 20th centuries, and probably extends, I think, into the 21st century. And she says that collapse of moral and religious standards now is reflective of the collapse of aesthetic standards in the 18th century. So, if you go back to writings of the 18th century, it's not just Kant, but there were dozens and dozens of people worried about the collapse of a kind of certainty of what was art. Art had been a reflection of, for a century or so, ideal Christian or moral values. That art was, supposed to reflect some sort of symmetrical order. And suddenly people start painting secular things and still lifes of food and birds of prey and people doing things they shouldn't be doing. And art is in crisis. And the question is, needless to say, we're not yet at pure abstraction or people who put toilets in a museum. And the question is, what is art? And she said, in the 18th century, these ideas of what is beautiful and what is art became central, and people were asking, how can we make a judgment? And Kant's attempt to answer it is, there are no rules for telling you what beauty is. You can't say beauty is only this or beauty is only that. And yet, in order to have a conversation about art and beauty, we have to be willing to make judgments, and we have to try and make those judgments encompass those at least who are willing to judge. There's a huge caveat there, right? Who do we include in those who are willing to judge? Is it only educated people? Is it only people, who have a certain cosmopolitan background? Or do we let everybody into the question? And those are the difficult questions about judgment, both aesthetically and politically. So theoretically, we find ourselves in the same situation of the 18th century with respect to judgments of taste. What is that situation? Radical plurality. A radical plurality, a loss of common sense, a loss that there are there's a common agreement, and yet somehow we have to build that common agreement, right? We have to reject the argument that de gustibus non disputandum est, that it's not. That judgments of taste are not simply subjective. We have to kind of create an intersubjectivity. And that's what she thinks that's what she thinks Kant was trying to articulate in the Critique of Taste or Judgment. And she thinks that's also why today Kant's Critique of Taste or Judgment is so important to politics. Was that You want me to say more? Is that good? Tell me what you're thinking.
That was great. I'm just wondering what allows Arendt to compare centuries without, does such a comparison really involve imagination, in the sense, are we then just sort of, when we are comparing examples, what are we engaged in?
Well, I mean, I think she compares centuries because in the 18th century, you see a breakdown of a consensus around beauty and taste. And there's an enormous outpouring of writing about what is beauty. It's still going on, right? That hasn't ended. I mean, if you look at, art, I mean, the only difference today is that most art theory simply thinks there is no common sense, that anything you want is art. There's just almost a complete, what she would call at the end, right? A complete indifference, that, anyone who would say there are standards for beauty today is thought to be out of touch and imposing some conservative standards or worldviews. And so there's a complete indifference and fear and rejection of judgment in art today. It's been completely, judgment in art today is almost a bad word, I think. She says, okay, Kant was someone who tried to think about the need for judgment in art. And in doing so, she says he built up a way of thinking about judgment that tries to salvage collective judgment without recourse to universals or standards or rules. And thus, she says, he tries to develop an idea of public judgment amidst plurality. And so she says, look, there's just and then today we see this situation in politics and in morality. And so we can turn to Kant as a way of thinking through how to save morality and politics in an age of radical plurality. I think that's the connection, right? She sees, I mean, in a way, what you see is the loss of standards and universals started in aesthetics and has made its way throughout other parts of society, and is now hit into politics, democracy, and morality. Barbara.
Yeah, I would like to talk about some of the sort of paradoxes of will and willpower that come up in this. And I thought I would start with talking about, in Alcoholics Anonymous, the first step in the person approaching relinquishing their addiction to alcohol is to admit that they are powerless over addiction, and fighting against it or using one's willpower to stop it. It is still sort of centering the power in oneself. And if we think of addiction as a kind of willful revolt against reality, not just as a kind of addiction to alcohol, or any other substance, but as an addiction to one's will, then the admission of powerlessness helps one achieve a kind of freedom from feeling like I have to control and will everything. And so in the working through of the steps of Alcoholics Anonymous, one is encouraged to remember what one has done to hurt other people. How it's actually encourages one to make an effort to decenter from one's will and to see the world from that liberum arbitrarium, from a more neutral viewpoint, and that ironically, giving up that feeling of my freedom is only my will is in other words, subjecting oneself to the requirements of reality. That's where freedom is, not in trying to dominate reality with one's will.
So it's just fascinating, Barbara. Thank you. So the idea, if I understand it, is that you have to first give up the idea that you can solve this through your will. And at some point you have to simply say, I have to succumb to the requirements of communal living. And that requires me to not drink, because drinking, in my case, leads me to violate the requirements of communal living. Is that what I'm hearing you say?
Yes, because it so far privileges my needs above the needs of those around me and the realities of those around me, that I'm not seeing the world as it is. I'm just seeing it from my point of view and from what I need and what I want and my will at the moment. And so it's the way it works is to remember what one has done and to acknowledge the legitimate grievances of those whom you have hurt through your drinking. So it's to try, I guess it's trying to achieve something, that I think that is akin to what Arendt values, a sense of the communal. Of course, one could never entirely give up the privileging of one's own position. That's impossible, but at least accommodating to the positions of what other people think and want. And the freedom or the feeling of freedom that's involved in acknowledging that one doesn't control everything with one's will. It's kind of paradoxical freedom.
Yeah. I think it's a really beautiful and powerful example. So I want to thank you for bringing it up. Nietzsche's thinking about, right, will in this sense, privileges a kind of will as power or strength. And Arendt says that in this idea of commanding, and that this joy, by on 132, she says, Nietzsche himself, this is 2/3 of the way down the page, Nietzsche himself calls this a self-delusion, namely, we only see ourselves as commanding, but a wholesome self-delusion, right? By identifying ourselves with the one who issues the commands, we experience the feeling of superiority, which comes from wielding power. And that there's a kind of joy and feeling of pleasure in overcoming. That she develops this further on 134, where she says that will and power, or feeling of power, are the same for Nietzsche. The goal of the will is to will, as the goal of life is to live. In order to feel alive, we actually have to feel powerful. And powerfulness is inherent in willing. Doesn't matter the object. On 135, though, well, on the top of 135, she draws out the implications for Nietzsche, which is that this overflow of strength is identified with the creative impulse and is the root of all productivity. So even people who are radically good, like Saint Francis of Assisi or Jesus of Nazareth, are not good because they seek the good. They're good because they have this incredible feeling of power in them, and they need to let it out. And they let it out in such a way that is that does a kind of exceptional good. There are other people who have this feeling of power and let it out in ways that people think of exceptionally bad, but the instigating factor, Nietzsche says, is the same. It's this feeling of power. Arendt then, on the bottom of 135, distinguishes herself from that and says, no doubt, this is about 5 lines from the bottom, no doubt this contains a serious underestimation of the secondary causes, namely the fact that it's good or bad, which after all include the morally decisive question of whether the will to do turns in the direction of doing right and wrong. So in a way, if I, she says this underestimation is comprehensible with Nietzsche, but it's, we may have to bring something else in. And so, Alcoholics Anonymous, as you described it, is a kind of attempt to elevate the secondary causes, right? How it affects other people, and minimize the creative impulse of simply overflowing power and a feeling of power or pleasure in power. And thus, go back to Neil's first question about how we value things and nihilism. We can say, oh, Alcoholics Anonymous is great because it turns us away from ourselves and turns us towards the, common good, and makes us aware of how our actions impact other people. And that's a good thing. But you can be a Nietzschean and say Alcoholics Anonymous neuters us. If you want to be really Nietzschean, you can say it destroys our manliness. It teaches us to sacrifice our power and our creativity in the name of conformity, right? And so, we can imagine, I think easily, people on both sides of that moral issue today. But I think you're right to, it's a great example, and glad you brought it up. Do you want to add it? We're short on time. I only got about 6 minutes left and a lot of questions.
So I will, I let other people go. Yeah.
But thank you, Barbara. I thought that was a great example. I hope what I said had something to do with what you were talking about.
Sure, it did. Yeah.
All right. We have 4 other hands up in 7 minutes, so we're not going to get to everyone clearly. Let's try and keep the questions very brief, and let's see. William, Conklin, Bill? I don't know.
Yeah, Roger, I'm still unclear about the relationship between thinking and the 2 in 1 on the one hand, and intersubjectivity. And it comes up quite often. My question, but at page 141, you referred to in the middle of the page. And my question is this: if there's intersubjectivity, if the problem is between 2 people, which comes first? Is the intersubjectivity dependent on I thinking and my 2 in 1 and becoming self-conscious of my prejudgments, etc.? Or do I find myself in the world, which you had described about 10 minutes ago, where I'm in dialogue with others and immersed with others, and my self-constituting self comes out of that?
Bill, this is a great question, and I'm just going to cut you off because I understand it, I think, and we're short on time. So let me try and answer it. You're asking the question, which I think bedevils people reading Arendt, of the relation between thinking and judgment, right? It seems to many people that thinking and judgment are the same. They're both about trying to think with other people, thinking with my other self, judging with an enlarged mentality of other people, and you can combine them. What's the difference then between thinking and judging? What I would say the answer is that thinking is simply talking to myself about whatever I'm talking to myself about. And it could be a mathematical theorem. It could be whether what beauty is. It could be what truth or justice is. It could be what I want for dinner tonight. The difference with judging is that judgment always starts with a particular. It always starts with an example. Thinking can be more abstract. Its thinking is still a conversation, but it can be a universal. It can be connected to the ideas. It doesn't have to, and it doesn't usually. It doesn't need to focus on examples and particulars. Judgment always is a kind of thinking motivated by a particular that you need to try and understand and make sense of. And I'd say that's the line that she would draw. I mean, there's probably others. I've written, this is one of those things where when you start to read about Arendt thinking and judgment, you start to say, oh, what's the line? I know I've written this, and I probably have other examples of the differences between them. I mean, I think they're very similar. I mean, I think judging is thinking, but for Arendt, but judging is thinking motivated by and inspired by particulars. That's to me the difference. Okay.
Yeah. Thank you.
Fran. Keep it short because we're really out of time almost, and I want to try and get to some questions. Please. Fran? You're a Fran. You're muted, Fran. All right.
Okay. Yeah. Go ahead. You have to end. No, I'm saying the comparative social history she suggests as a methodology that was brought up before about, what's the relevance of 18th, 19th, 20th century. The conventional wisdom gets developed by the plurality, and it could be Nazism or communism or whatever. I find that, she's saying, not that it's an ideal plurality. That's common sense. Common sense can be anything if it's historically rooted within a particular philosophical and economic time. And that's the idea of no more heroes. The 20th century bourgeoisie has no really need for heroes, unless it's militaristic. So the Socratic ideal really doesn't fit this mode of production right now. Thank you.
Thank you. That's helpful. And I'm just going to take it as a comment and go on to Jeff.
Yeah, my question is easy to ask. It might not be quick to answer. The idea of company was used both to introduce this lecture and to close it, right?
Company.
Company. Yeah. On page 125, she sort of describes it as with the question of with whom I wish to be together.
Yeah.
Right. So, and then 21 pages later, on the very bottom of 145, it says the choice of company. Right. So the question is, and obviously this relates to the idea of world. That she got from Heidegger, basically, and for Heidegger, it's thrownness. Right. You're in the world with other people. You deal with who you have. But now there's this idea where you get to choose, and of course that relates to Eichmann as you've been describing it, right? It's like, well, can we choose to live with somebody who's committed these horrible crimes? So my question is just like, how does this introduction of choice of company, obviously it seems like it's going to relate to the friendship conference as well. So I'm just really interested in this thread.
Oh, you're absolutely right. Oh, can people mute? I'm just going to mute everyone so I don't get the. You're absolutely right, and this goes back to the line at the end of Crisis and Culture, which I keep coming back to, and I think she recites earlier in this essay as well, which is that that the essence of humanism and judgment is that I'd rather be wrong with my friends and Plato than right with his enemies. The point is that morality doesn't come from rules, right? It comes from thinking, which means a depth and remembering through examples and through particulars. And this, when I think of an example, am I going to hold myself in the company of Socrates, who says I'd rather suffer wrong than do wrong? Or am I going to hold myself in company with Bluebeard, who says, let's take what I can get? The problem, she says, of morality is not lack of rules or bad rules or good rules. It's indifference to the company you keep and who your friends are and who you want to be with and who you read and who you imagine yourself in community with will sort of set the moral tenor of an age. And if you're able to be friends with someone who lies and cheats in order to gain power, whether you're a Republican or a Democrat or something else in between, that's a fear of judgment, and that's the greatest danger. That's that kind of indifference, that willing to justify and rationalize being in company with, friends with people who lie and cheat in order to gain power, is the greatest danger. All right, we're out of time, but Maria, you can state your question very briefly if you can, and I'll try and give it a quick answer.
Thank you. Yeah, I live in El Salvador, and I just wondered if you could expand just a little bit more on what you said before on the parallels you drew between the justification of fascism and what's happening here, just briefly. I mean, maybe for next time, and I'll definitely read your article.
Yeah, no. So first of all, Maria, thank you. I don't claim to be an expert in El Salvador at all. A few weeks ago, I don't. You get the Amor Mundi newsletter we send out. I don't know if you saw it, but I linked to an article. I forget even who wrote it. Maybe someone has it or can find it and put it in the chat. But I linked to an article in which someone said that the president of El Salvador, and I apologize, I forgot his name. You can tell me his name.
Nayib Bukele.
Bukele.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. The argument was that he was sort of the poster child for the new populism, because he was an example of a populist who was actually delivering for the people. I don't know if you find that to be an accurate factual representation of what's going on. I just read the article, but the argument in the article was that insofar as his populism was actually making people's lives better, there was an argument for justifying it, and that the danger in populism today is that for many people, their lives are really deteriorating for safety reasons or a feeling of economic degradation and feeling of powerlessness and feeling of precarity and that people on both the left and the right are increasingly open to people who say, forget these silly moral civil liberties, these silly moral, wokeisms, forget, this idea that you have. It's much more important. We need order. We need progress, we need economics, and that Bukele, the man in the president of El Salvador, was sort of a poster child for what populism makes it popular and gets right. That was the argument, and I simply connected it to some Arendtian thoughts as well in one of the Amor Mundi posts. Does that ring true or not?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's just everything is happening so quickly, and it's scary at the same time. But I work with the UN, and I was currently working with some projects on rebuilding the social fabric in the communities where many of the gang members were extracted from. So you get to see people whose lives were actually, touched immediately and are, trying to be improved. So it's just really hard to, exactly what you mentioned, many people are justifying on those grounds, but at what cost? So that's why I was just wondering, because I just feel like no one has the time to reflect on it. And whoever does is also being silenced in some way. So I just wanted to take the opportunity that we're in this space to ask. And I missed the article, so I'm going to look back into what you wrote. So I'm going to look back into the newsletter, and I'll definitely read it. So thank you so much for that.
Thank you very much, Maria. That's excellent. And thanks for the great work. All right, we are out of time, but thank you. The next essay we're going to read is Collective Responsibility. I forget when we're reading it. I think we're taking a short break because we have a lot going on here at the Arendt Center the next week or two. When you can look on our website, and Phil will
July 21st.
July 21st. So yeah, we have like a month and a half break. I don't know what you're going to do with your Friday afternoons in that month and a half. I apologize. But I will miss you for the month and a half, but I will look forward to seeing you all on July 21st and coming back to reading Arendt with you. Have a great break, and we'll see you all very soon. Thanks very much. Enjoy reading Hannah Arendt.
We'll miss you too, Professor Roger.
Guten Sommer.
Guten Sommer. Ja. Alles Gutes.
Nicht zu heiß.
Yeah. Thank you, guys.
Gracias, Professor Roger.
Gracias.